Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. And what if I told you that handing a chronically homeless individual the keys to a subsidized apartment and, placing them in a high-paying job might actually be the absolute worst thing you could do for their long-term survival?
Yeah, it sounds incredibly counterintuitive, right? Especially given, how modern public policy usually approaches the issue.
Right.
Because we're entirely conditioned to view poverty and homelessness as like simple math problem, a deficit of physical resources that could just be solved by an injection of physical resources.
Exactly. But today, for our deep dive, we're examining a source that fundamentally shatters that whole mathematical equation.
It really does.
Our focus today is a thoroughly detailed academic paper. It's titled Sunday Breakfast Mission, a Christian non-medical model toward addiction, homelessness, rehabilitation, and it's authored by Reverend Tom Laymon.
Yeah, and we're looking at the operational philosophy of a 129-year-old institution based in Wilmington, Delaware.
And their core premise is, it's startling, to be honest. They argue that homelessness is almost never about missing material things.
Right.
It's actually about the absolute catastrophic severing of all human relationships.
Which is just a radical departure from the prevailing narrative we hear today.
Totally.
The Sunday Breakfast Mission, which we'll just refer to as SBM from here on out, they operate on the belief that a lack of money or shelter is merely a symptom.
Just a symptom.
Yeah. The actual disease is a ruptured relational web. And in their century plus of experience, they find that this rupture is overwhelmingly driven by severe substance abuse.
So, okay, let's unpack this. If the disease is a severed relational web, then the cure obviously requires a completely different kind of medicine.
Exactly.
Today, we're exploring SBM's methodology for completely deconstructing and rebuilding a person's social, psychological, and spiritual operating system.
But, before we look at how they manage this today, we really need to understand the architectural foundation of this entire philosophy.
Right, the history.
We have to go back to the origins, because SBM is part of a historical lineage that dates back far before 1893. To fully grasp the why behind their methodology, you have to look at the historical triggers that created the rescue mission model in the first place.
And Layman's paper explicitly traces this, right?
Yes, it traces SBM's lineage all the way back to a movement sparked in Glasgow, Scotland in 1826.
Wow.
Yeah, by a man named David Naismith.
Glasgow in 1826. We're looking right at the explosive acceleration of the Industrial Revolution.
Precisely. And what Naismith observed in Glasgow is the exact same sociological phenomena that eventually birthed SBM in America.
So what was he seeing exactly?
Well, Naismith was watching this massive demographic migration. Young men were leaving the Scottish Highlands, leaving these very traditional agrarian, tight-knit village structures.
Right, where everybody knows everybody.
Exactly. And they were flooding into the rapidly industrializing urban center of Glasgow just to find factory work.
Which means they were leaving an environment where their behavior was, highly regulated by their community. In a Highland village in the 1820s, everyone knows your family, everyone knows your business, and you have a defined load-bearing role in that society.
You're completely embedded in a social web.
Right. You take that young man, drop him into a massive anonymous industrial machine where he's essentially a replaceable cog, and the psychological shock must have been profound.
That is the exact mechanism of the crisis right there.
Yeah.
Naismith saw that these young men were completely disconnected from their traditional support structures.
You're just floating.
Yeah. And in the anonymity of the city, working these grueling hours and brutal conditions, they were seeking any form of relief. The local pub was often the only heated space available to them.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the heating aspect.
Yeah. So Naismith watched this hyper-urban isolation act as a direct catalyst for rampant substance abuse and basically societal dissolution.
It's like the Industrial Revolution didn't just create new technologies, it essentially manufactured a brand new social disease.
Mass hyper-urban isolation.
Yeah. And these early missions were like the first emergency room specifically designed to treat it. But I have a question about the nature of that response.
Sure.
Did Naismith and later the founders of SBM view this as mere charity? Were they just trying to give these guys a warm bowl of soup so they didn't freeze? Or were they actually trying to intervene in the behavioral collapse?
The historical documentation shows it was an active, aggressive intervention from day one.
Really?
Yeah. Naismith, who was a newly converted Christian at the time, didn't just want to warehouse these men. He combined immediate physical rescue with intense spiritual and relational intervention.
Because he knew the village structure was gone.
Exactly. He recognized that a new structure had to be artificially built around these men to stabilize them. And that model, the synthesis of physical rescue and deep relational discipleship, it rapidly spread across Europe.
It went to London, Dublin, and eventually crossed the Atlantic.
Right over to the United States.
Which brings us across the ocean to 1893 in Wilmington, Delaware, the Gilded Age. You've got massive wealth inequality, rapid industrial expansion, and the exact same urban isolation Naismith saw in Scotland.
And SPM begins in a very grassroots way in Wilmington.
Super grassroots. I mean, the paper notes they literally started by providing a Sunday morning breakfast and a church service to a few dozen men on the streets.
Just a Sunday breakfast. But the reality of the crisis immediately outpaced that limited scope.
Right, because Sunday breakfast doesn't keep you warm on a Tuesday night.
Exactly. They quickly recognized that it did absolutely nothing to protect these men from the physical elements during the week.
And the logistics of their pivot here are just fascinating to me. The source mentions that to start offering nightly shelter, they actually had to borrow cots from another organization.
From the Whosoever Gospel Mission.
Right, all the way in Germantown, Pennsylvania. It paints such a vivid picture of the sheer desperation of the time. I mean, they're crossing state lines just to find canvas beds so people don't freeze to death on the cobblestones.
It really highlights that this wasn't, a heavily endowed, top-down government initiative. It was a local community desperately trying to construct a makeshift emergency room for a hemorrhaging social crisis.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
And for generations, the demographic they were treating remained relatively static. Historically, the typical individual seeking refuge at SPM was an isolated man in his 50s.
But the paper brings up a terrifying shift in the data, because the Wilmington of 1893 is long gone, and the faces of this crisis have changed dramatically.
You really have.
If we look at the modern demographic breakdown that SPM is dealing with today, it's no longer just older men.
No. The paper points out a sober reality. Today, both nationally across the U.S. and specifically within SPM's daily operations, the majority of the homeless population is comprised of women and children combined.
That is just heartbreaking.
And the single adult men and women they see are significantly younger than they were in previous generations.
I really want to pause on that for a second for everyone listening, because the implications are massive. In ecology, there's this concept of an indicator species.
Like frogs. Right.
Exactly. Frogs are a great example. It's an organism whose presence or absence reflects the overall health of an entire ecosystem. If the water is toxic, the frogs disappear first.
Right.
When your primary homeless demographic is 50-year-old men, you might argue that represents late-stage individual failure, a long sequence of bad luck and bad choices. But when the primary demographic becomes young mothers and children...
It's completely different.
Yeah, that is an indicator species signaling early-stage community collapse.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. Mm-hmm. You're no longer looking at an isolated individual falling through the cracks of a functioning system. You are looking at the catastrophic failure of the family unit itself.
The core building block.
Yeah, the relational breakdown is happening at the very beginning of the human life cycle now, rather than at the end of it.
So how does an organization that was historically built to house older single men adapt to the logistical nightmare of sheltering young families? I mean, that's a completely different operation.
They had to entirely reconstruct their physical and operational footprint. The text notes that in 2010, SPM opened a massive new facility explicitly designed to accommodate women and women with children.
While still maintaining operations for the men.
Yes, of course.
And the daily volume described in the paper is just staggering. We are talking about 130 to over 200 men, women, boys, and girls every single night.
It's a huge operation.
Think about the friction of managing that environment. You have teenage boys, young single women, mothers with toddlers, and older men struggling with severe addiction, all requiring shelter under one organizational roof.
It's a logistical engine. They're churning out hundreds of full-course hot dinners, massive breakfasts, managing shower schedules.
Distributing clothing, shoes, hygiene products.
Yeah, and nestled within that long list of daily services is one specific administrative function that perfectly illustrates the underlying philosophy of connection we were talking about.
Oh, the mail reception.
Yes. The paper specifically highlights that SPM provides mail reception for their guests.
Now, that feels like such a minor administrative task compared to, like, food and shelter. Why emphasize mail reception in an academic paper?
Because in the context of the modern bureaucratic state, if you do not have a mailing address, you effectively cease to exist.
Wow. Put that way, it's chilling.
A mailing address is the fundamental tether to societal participation.
Right, of course. I mean, try getting a state ID without an address.
Exactly. You can't obtain a driver's license. You can't apply for a job because employers need an address for tax forms. You can't receive government benefits, and you certainly can't sign a lease for an apartment.
So losing your address is the bureaucratic equivalent of being erased.
That's a great way to put it. By providing mail reception, SBM is acting as a proxy tether. They're holding on to that administrative thread so the individual doesn't completely float away from the grid.
It's the paper trail of human existence. Now, providing that mail reception, the hot meals, the safe beds, all of this is crucial triage. But the paper makes a definitive pivot here.
A very important pivot.
Yeah, SPM argues that if society stops at providing these physical things, we are actively failing. And to understand their actual rehabilitation model, we really have to look at what SPM explicitly claims homelessness is not.
The paper systematically dismantles three of the most pervasive myths surrounding homelessness. The first assumption they reject is the idea that homelessness is simply a function of poverty.
Just a lack of cash.
Right. SPM states clearly that supplementing poverty with additional material resources does not provide a path out of the condition.
Which leads directly into the second assumption they dismantle. And this one is a massive friction point in current public policy debates. They completely reject the idea that the crisis is caused by houselessness or a simple lack of affordable housing.
Yeah, because the prevailing societal narrative often blames real estate markets. The logic is that rent is simply too high for the bottom economic tier to afford.
Right, people are just priced out.
But SBM approaches this from their direct daily experience. Their observation is that people do not generally come to their mission because they were abruptly priced out of a sustainable life. They come because the individual fundamentally failed to maintain their housing.
So the issue isn't the barrier to entry into the housing market. The issue is the behavioral inability to sustain the lease once they are in.
Precisely. The paper points out a grim mechanism here. Available resources, including rent money, are consistently diverted to what they term less appropriate activities.
Meaning substance use.
Primarily substance use, yes. If a person's behavioral priority is securing the substance rather than securing their shelter, simply handing them a subsidized apartment does not alter the behavioral hierarchy.
Because the addiction will just inevitably compromise the free housing just as thoroughly as it compromised the paid housing.
Exactly.
I do want to push back on that slightly, though, because if you read the news, you see plenty of valid reports about the lack of affordable, safe housing in urban centers. Doesn't the physical environment play some role in their ability to recover?
SBM actually agrees with you on the environmental aspect, but they view it through a slightly different lens. The paper argues that for housing to be an effective tool in recovery, it can't just be four walls and a roof. It must be what they call reasonable housing.
Okay, what defines reasonable housing?
It means it has to be located in well-policed neighborhoods that are entirely free of drug sellers.
I see.
Because if you take an individual who is fiercely battling a chemical dependency and you place them into a highly subsidized apartment, but that apartment happens to be in a neighborhood where narcotics are actively sold on the corner.
You aren't providing a solution at all. You're placing them in an active hazard zone.
Right. You are setting them up for an inevitable relapse.
And the paper also introduces mental health into this housing equation, specifically regarding executive function, right?
Yes. They note that a significant portion of the adult homeless population suffers from severe mental illness or mental disabilities.
Right, which affects everyday tasks.
Heavily. These individuals often lack the baseline executive function required to self-administer their own affairs. Managing a lease, remembering to pay the electric bill, navigating maintenance requests, these are highly complex administrative tasks.
So providing an apartment to someone without the cognitive bandwidth to manage it is an incomplete intervention.
It's setting them up to fail.
Okay, so it isn't just poverty, and it isn't just a deficit of housing. The third assumption they reject is the one that I actually found truly shocking when we were reading the source material.
I know exactly which one you mean.
Yeah, they explicitly state that joblessness and high unemployment are not the prominent causes of homelessness.
This directly attacks the most common societal refrain, why don't they just get a job?
Right, everyone says that.
But SBM's data reveals something deeply counterintuitive. They report that many homeless men and women maintain steady employment for years while remaining completely homeless.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's explore the mechanics of that. You have a person working 40 hours a week, receiving a regular paycheck, and yet they are sleeping under a highway overpass or in a mission shelter every single night.
How does that happen? Because the income stream is entirely captured by the addiction.
Wow.
The paycheck does not go toward rent or savings or stability. It is immediately liquidated to fuel the substance dependency.
And this leads to what is arguably the most radical operational tactic in the entire paper. Because SBM recognizes that the paycheck is fueling the destruction, the paper notes that they frequently encourage homeless adults to actively quit their jobs in order to enter the residential rehabilitation program.
It's a profound shift in perspective. If you view a job as an inherently positive, stabilizing force, telling someone to quit seems like sabotage.
It sounds insane at first glance.
But SBM views the job not as stability, but as the engine powering the addiction. If you don't shut the engine down, you cannot safely rebuild the machine.
It's like trying to pour water into a bucket with no bottom. Giving someone a paycheck or an apartment is just pouring more water. SBM is saying, stop pouring the water, let's fix the bucket first, even if you have to stop working to do it.
That's a perfect analogy.
So if a lack of money, houses, or jobs isn't the root cause of the problem, what exactly is the bottomless hole in the bucket? How does SBM define the actual nature of homelessness?
They define it as a completely ruptured web. The paper states that homelessness is the severe breaking of critical relationships.
The absolute severing of ties.
Yeah, ties to family, to friends, to employers, to the church, to the government, to schools, and to landlords.
This is a brilliant sociological framework because when politicians and economists talk about the social safety net, they're almost always referring to government programs.
Right, food stamps, unemployment insurance, housing subsidies.
But SBM argues that the true social safety net is actually an interpersonal web. Think about this concept as a load-bearing structure for a second. If I lose my job tomorrow, my life does not immediately collapse onto the pavement.
No, you have buffers.
Right. My savings account takes the first impact. If that cracks, my family takes, say, 30% of the emotional and financial load. My friends take 20%. My landlord might offer a grace period, taking another 10%. I have a massive, invisible, load-bearing architecture made entirely of human trust holding me up.
Exactly. Landlords offer grace to tenants who have historically communicated well. Friends offer short-term loans. Parents offer a spare bedroom.
You can crash on a couch.
Right. SBM's fundamental assertion is that, barring extreme independent wealth, the systematic destruction of all these relationships inevitably results in homelessness.
Wow.
To end up on the street, you have to experience a massive, sustained behavioral disruption that burns through every single one of those relational lifelines. You must exhaust the patience of your family, burn the trust of your friends, alienate your employer, and force your landlord to evict you.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a minute.
Go for it.
Are they completely ignoring macroeconomic factors? What about a massive recession or hyperinflation or a global pandemic that wipes out an entire industry? Do they really believe relationships are the only factor?
It's a very important distinction to make. The paper does not deny that macroeconomic shocks exist. But SBM's philosophy suggests that economic disasters are the gravity that applies stress to the structure.
Okay, the gravity.
Yet the relational web is what dictates whether the structure actually collapses under that gravity. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, millions lost their jobs, but they didn't all become homeless because their relational webs caught them. The people who hit the pavement were the ones whose webs were already compromised.
That makes total sense. And what is the force that compromises the web? What acts like termites inside those load-bearing beams of trust? The paper provides a definitive, numerical answer for this.
It does. Substance abuse. The text states that substance abuse is prominent in over 90% of the individuals who utilize the Sunday breakfast mission.
Over 90%. I mean, that is not a margin of error. That is the overwhelming mechanism of destruction.
And when you understand the psychology of severe addiction, that 90% statistic perfectly aligns with the ruptured web theory. Addiction is inherently deceptive and demanding.
It changes your behavior completely.
It forces the individual to lie to their parents to get money. It drives them to steal from their siblings. It causes them to abandon their shifts at work. It methodically, piece by piece, dismantles every single relationship until the individual is entirely isolated.
The paper also mentions mental illness in this context. How does that factor into the web? Is it a separate issue entirely?
Mental illness is highly prevalent, but the paper notes it often lacks a clear, solitary delineation from the addiction.
They blend together.
Yeah, in a vast majority of cases, the substance abuse is an attempt at self-medication for underlying, untreated psychological trauma or disorders. But whether the isolation begins with a chemical dependency or an untreated mental health crisis, the terminal result is identical.
The total alienation of the individual from any supporting community.
Exactly.
So we have the diagnosis. The disease is a shattered relational web driven 90% of the time by the destructive behaviors of addiction. If that is the diagnosis, a quick fix is impossible.
Oh, absolutely.
You cannot repair a decade of burned trust with a weekend seminar. And this brings us to SBM's cure, the New Life Discipleship Program.
This is the operational core of the paper. The New Life Discipleship Program is a completely free, highly structured residential program available to men, women, and women with children.
And the timeline alone indicates how seriously they take the depth of the trauma here. The program runs for 18 to 24 months.
2 full years.
They are asking adults to voluntarily submit to a highly controlled environment for up to 2 years. Before we even get into the theology of it, my immediate thought as a listener is, how on earth do you keep an adult with severe addiction inside a facility for that long?
It's a huge challenge.
I mean, they aren't prisoners. What stops them from just walking out the front door on day 45 when the cravings become unbearable?
That is the central challenge of any long-term rehabilitation. SBM approaches this through highly structured phases to build psychological buy-in. It begins with stage 1, which is a strict 30-day probationary period.
What happens in those first 30 days?
It basically acts as a massive psychological and physiological shock absorber.
Because they're coming right off the street.
Right. The individual is coming straight out of the chaos. Their nervous system is entirely dysregulated. During probation, they participate in initial orientation classes, engage in daily work therapy, and attend morning and evening chapels.
So it's about establishing a baseline.
Simple stabilization. Can this person adhere to a basic schedule? Can they exist in a communal space without violence? If they demonstrate that baseline willingness, they transition into stage 2.
Stage 2 is where the actual architecture of the mind gets addressed. The paper outlines 3 levels within this stage, focused on deconstructing the old life, reconstructing a new life, and rebuilding key relationships.
This is achieved through an intense daily regimen. Individual counseling, group therapy, educational classes, continued work therapy, and daily spiritual engagement.
I want to focus on that concept of deconstructing the old life. What does that actually mean mechanistically? Because someone who has survived on the streets for 10 years has developed massive psychological calluses.
You have to survive.
Right. They've learned to be hypervigilant, defensive, and manipulative just to survive the night. It sounds like they are treating the person's previous worldview like a condemned building that has to be completely demolished before you can pour a new foundation. How difficult is it to ask someone to endure that? You can't just politely ask them to drop those defenses.
It's incredibly difficult. SBM uses the phrase, peeling away layers of destructive attitudes. In practice, this means systematically confronting the survival mechanisms that kept them alive on the street, but are toxic in a healthy society.
Oh, that sounds grueling.
It is. In group counseling, the manipulation tactics are called out by peers. The defensive anger is unpacked in individual sessions. It is an agonizing process of forcing the individual to look at the wreckage of their past behaviors without the numbing agent of their addiction.
And this is where we have to explicitly discuss the lens through which SBM conducts this intense psychological demolition. The title of the paper calls this a Christian non-medical model.
This is a crucial distinction from modern clinical approaches. SBM approaches the entire 18 to 24-month rehabilitation from a distinctly biblical and Christian counseling perspective.
Wait, hold on. I have to push back here just to clarify for everyone listening. In the 21st century, addiction is widely understood by the psychiatric community as a profound neurological disease.
Yes, the disease model.
Right. It literally rewires the dopamine and reward pathways of the human brain. How can a program call itself a non-medical model and still be safe or effective? Are they just ignoring the physiological reality of chemical withdrawal?
It's an essential question. When SBM uses the term non-medical, they aren't rejecting the reality of physiological withdrawal. They partner with local medical facilities for initial physical detox when necessary. What they are rejecting is the purely clinical framing of the long-term recovery. They're pushing back against the idea that addiction is solely a psychiatric disease to be managed with indefinite pharmaceutical interventions.
Okay, so they handle the acute physical danger medically, but the psychological rebuild is handled theologically.
Exactly. Instead of relying on clinical psychiatric jargon, they utilize theological frameworks. They frame the addiction and the resulting homelessness as manifestations of destructive life patterns and the effects of sin.
And we should pause here to make something very clear to our listeners. We are objectively reporting SBM's methodology as outlined in the academic paper. We're not endorsing the religious viewpoint or evaluating the absolute truth of the theology, but simply reporting how SBM utilizes this specific religious framework as a tool to drive behavioral change.
That's right. And importantly, the paper notes that individuals are not required to be or become Christians to join or stay in the program.
Right. No forced conversion.
No. It's a framework offered to everyone, regardless of background. But if we analyze why this framework is behaviorally effective, it really comes down to the locus of control.
Explain that locus of control a bit more.
If you tell someone they are a patient with an incurable chronic brain disease, you risk instilling a sense of passive victimhood. The locus of control is external. The disease is happening to them.
Right, they feel powerless.
But the theological model SBM uses, framing these actions as sin and destructive habits, shifts the locus of control entirely inward. It insists on absolute human agency.
I see. It says, you made deeply destructive moral choices, and therefore you have the power to make entirely different moral choices moving forward. It forces a level of supreme personal accountability.
Precisely. It's a God-centered view of human nature that demands active, daily, internal moral renewal. The 5-level counseling architecture guides this. Level 1 is probation. Level 2 is peeling away those defensive, destructive layers we discussed. Oh, yeah. Level 3 is pouring the new foundation, establishing positive habits through Christ-centered redemption. Level 4 focuses on the core of their philosophy, actively reconnecting those broken relationships with family and society. And level 5 is real-world practice.
You know, from a behavioral science perspective, it is actually quite elegant. Severe addiction creates a massive, overpowering dopamine loop centered on a chemical. You can't just leave that void empty.
No, nature abhors a vacuum.
Right. So SBM's model replaces the destructive chemical loop with a deeply rigorous, spiritually driven community loop. They are replacing isolation with intense, structured belonging.
But as any addiction specialist will tell you, the ultimate test of a program is not how well the individual behaves while safely insulated inside the facility.
Right. You can build a magnificent, structurally sound ship inside a dry dock, but eventually you have to put that ship into the violent ocean.
That's the real test.
Once this 24-month internal foundation is poured and the individual has achieved sobriety and spiritual renewal, what happens next? Because if you just open the front doors, shake their hand, and drop them onto the sidewalk, the sheer panic of modern life will almost certainly trigger a relapse.
SBM understands that transition is the point of maximum vulnerability. And that is why the final stage of their program, called aftercare, is engineered as a massive, highly supervised on-ramp back into independence.
It's not just a handshake and a good luck.
Not at all. It's deliberately slow, and it is broken into 2 distinct phases.
Let's break down Aftercare I. The paper says this lasts for an agreed-upon period of 6 to 9 months. During this time, the individual finally steps out and secures external employment, but they do not move out of the mission. They use this income to aggressively save money for transportation and future housing.
And during this phase, SBM enforces a requirement that I believe is the unsung genius of their entire operational model.
Oh, the legal stuff.
Yes. During Aftercare I, the individual is strictly required to pay off deferred legal fines and other past obligations.
That is so profoundly realistic. If you have been living on the streets, surviving a severe addiction for a decade, you are dragging a catastrophic anchor of legal wreckage behind you.
Outstanding bench warrants for public intoxication, unpaid court fees, massive child support arrears.
Or just traffic tickets that have multiplied exponentially with late fees. You cannot simply pretend that history evaporated just because you got sober.
Exactly. Think about the psychological mechanism of a relapse. If you send a newly sober graduate out into the world with an apartment and a minimum wage job, they feel fragile but hopeful. Then, 2 weeks later, their wages are suddenly garnished for a 5-year-old child support debt, or they get pulled over and arrested because their license is suspended from an old unpaid ticket.
The sheer panic and despair of that moment is an overwhelming treasure to use again.
Yes, SBM forces them to clear the minefield before they are allowed to walk through it.
So what does this all mean? They only exit into independent living after the legal wreckage is cleared and sufficient savings are stockpiled. But the paper notes that for some, the journey doesn't end there. There is an aftercare 2 phase.
Yes, aftercare 2 can last up to an additional 2 years.
So we are potentially looking at a 4-year continuous intervention. This completely shatters the idea of a quick fix. What is the purpose of aftercare 2?
Aftercare 2 is focused on basic survival and stabilization, right? Clearing debts, maintaining entry-level work. Aftercare 2 is designed for individuals who want to elevate their trajectory from mere survival to actual thriving.
Thriving, not just surviving.
The paper explicitly lists goals like finishing a college degree, obtaining specialized technical certificates, preparing for marriage, or, incredibly, saving enough capital to purchase a house.
The idea of taking someone from chronic street-level homelessness to actual home ownership is staggering. How does the program facilitate that kind of upward mobility?
With the approval of their specific long-term plan, the resident transitions into mission housing. They pay a modest monthly program fee, and in exchange, they receive ongoing intensive coaching to achieve these ambitious goals.
That modest fee is essentially simulated rent. It's like training wheels for independent adult life. You have to learn how to budget a portion of your income for housing, but if you make a mistake, you aren't immediately evicted onto the street.
Right, you're corrected in a safe, grace-filled environment. Furthermore, it preserves the relational web they just spent 2 years building.
The psychological benefit of that must be huge.
It is. Stepping back into the chaotic workforce or entering a stressful college environment is taxing. Aftercare 2 allows them to face the friction of the real world during the day, but return every evening to a healthy, sober, spiritually aligned community. They don't have to sever their new lifelines to rejoin society.
It meticulously protects the massive investment of time and energy both the mission and the individual have made. When you look at the sheer duration of this intervention probation, deep deconstruction, habit reconstruction, debt clearing, and long-term goal coaching, you completely understand why Reverend Laymon's paper concludes that these graduates are highly successful in permanently breaking the cycles of addiction.
It really is a phenomenal, comprehensive system. We began this discussion looking at the smog-filled streets of 1826 Glasgow, watching David Naismith realize that simple charity could not cure the disease of urban isolation.
And we watched that exact realization echo through 1893 Wilmington, Delaware.
And we've explored how a modern facility manages the overwhelming logistics of treating that exact same disease today.
SBM's radical thesis that homelessness isn't a lack of money or keys, but a catastrophic failure of human relationships, primarily driven by addiction, requires a years-long spiritually driven deconstruction and reconstruction to cure.
It forces you to view the individual standing on the street corner through a completely different lens. You aren't looking at an economic deficit. You're looking at a collapsed universe of human connection.
It's so true. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Reverend Laymon's paper, I think SBM's philosophy leaves you, the listener, with a final, deeply provocative thought. If SBM is right, that our true safety net isn't our bank account, but the health of our relationships, it makes you wonder.
It absolutely turns the lens on the house population.
Yeah. How many of us who are currently housed and employed are actually walking around with frayed relational safety nets?
Masked entirely by our temporary economic stability.
Exactly. If your bank account vanished tomorrow, how strong is the interpersonal web catching you? Do you have people who would genuinely let you sleep on their couch for 6 months?
It's a profound way to redefine what true security actually looks like.
The ultimate shelter is not the house. It's the people who will stand by you when the house is gone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this incredible deep dive today. We hope this exploration of the Sunday Breakfast Mission challenged your assumptions and gave you a powerful new framework to consider. Keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time.